Welcome to PACKOLUTION. In this podcast series, you'll hear the experts of the packaging industry talking about sustainability and the future of packaging. It is brought to you by Watron and hosted by one of its founders, Michaela Wachtel, and Sales Director Ton Kniepscher.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of PACKOLUTION, the disruptive podcast brought to you by Watron. Today we have Professor Pierre Pienaar, President of the World Packaging Organization, as our guest, with whom we'll be talking about the worldwide connections regarding packaging and its problems and solutions across the globe. Welcome, Pierre.
Thanks very much, Ton. Not only do I look forward to this interview, I think it's certainly my privilege to share something about, what I do and what the World Packaging Organization does. So I always find these interviews of value, but I also find them interesting. Sometimes I find them fascinating as well in what sort of questions are asked or what interests the person asking the questions, because that varies so much between people.
Now let's hope we can kick a triple whammy here. So can you tell us a bit about yourself and your career path for our listeners?
Well, for me, like many folk of my era or my age or that sort of sector that probably started in the early 80s, very few of us embarked on a packaging career from the initial stage. And I'm certainly one of those. There was no ways I had any idea of what packaging was or is at the time. And my sights were not there at all. So I started my career in pharmacy. So after I finished university, I worked for a very large pharmaceutical manufacturing company in South Africa. And those formative years that really shaped, I guess, what I do today. Because what I did establish was, after a year in drug analysis, majority of the time, I felt this was not really what I wanted to do. And there were four of us, new graduates, that were called into the managing director's office on a Monday morning. And he said, we spent a lot of money on drugs and research and development from a drug perspective, a product perspective. But we also spend a lot of money on packaging, and we don't know what we're doing. I want one of you by the end of this week to come back to me and volunteer to change careers. And I thought, yes, this is it. This is exactly what I need in my life. And I volunteered. Fortunately, the other three were not interested at all. They were staying on their career paths of pharmacy. And so I told the managing director on the Friday, he said, that's great. Now you can go back to university and study packaging, which I did. I did through Brunel University in London. And I did my master's in packaging engineering and science, or packaging science and engineering. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful attending Brunel, but I only attended their summer school. The rest was done by correspondence. And once I went into packaging, I loved it. I just loved what I was doing. I ate, slept, drank packaging, and I immersed myself in a field that was new of folk being 100% in packaging, driven by it, understanding the science, understanding the technology, getting involved in the engineering of packaging. And that has taken me all over the globe, hence one of it where I am now.
It's fantastic to hear that you got the packaging bug. It's amazing.
The World Packaging Organization, where you're working for now, the WPO, is a worldwide operating organization. Could you please give our listeners a broad overview of what the WPO does?
It's very broad. It's made up currently of 62 member countries. So you are only a member of the World Packaging Organization, or the acronym WPO, as a country. Within that country, there's an association or an institution or an organization that looks after the well-being of packaging for that country. And so that's by the membership. However, this global organization, because there are 62 members and growing, and I say growing, we've probably grown around, certainly since I've been involved. We are growing in around about 4 to 5 new countries every year, which is fantastic at the moment, which is really encouraging that more countries are seeing the value in a global organization like this. And it is valuable in the sense that it's a global network. So in my own consulting company, one might pick up issues or challenges, and, it's literally a one sentence that goes out to, 62 countries overnight, and by the following morning I have the answer. Someone in the world knows something about what I'm asking. And so this network of information exchange is enormous. So there's a lot of sharing of knowledge. There's a lot of benchmarking and best practices between the organizations around the world. And this strengthens the industry, and it stimulates growth worldwide and encourages the development continuously of packaging technology, the science, and the engineering. Now, to some degree, we contribute to the development of international trade by the sheer manner of this interrelationship between countries on a daily basis. I would be in contact with probably no less than 3 to 5 countries every day of my life, and hearing what's going on, or there's something new in another country, or there's some education or training they require, because the WPO offers education and training in those disciplines that I've just mentioned previously, and we send out teams to do just that. And so we've, not during COVID, but prior to COVID, we were training face-to-face in a classroom environment all around the world, predominantly in developing countries. So this worldwide network is a fantastic way of ensuring that you're staying abreast with the technology of packaging at all times. Yeah. So one thing I must just add to relate into that question, and that is that we also have a World Star Awards program. And now that is fantastic in itself, because that is stimulating the development of new technology, because there's this competition between countries all the time. And so it's the best of the best that are awarded a World Star every year.
Now, on that topic, it's good to tell our listeners that Watron has won a World Star Award with our digital sealing technology. So we're thrilled. So I can tell you, as a small German company, with all respect, we are absolutely thrilled with that.
And I'm as thrilled to know that you have won one. I get such enjoyment, and I really mean this. I get such pleasure in handing out over those trophies over the years in my role as president. Obviously, in the last 2 years, we haven't done it physically, we've done it virtually. But to see the smiles on the faces of the recipients and the value that it brings them and their company, it just thrilled. It really, I cannot be more thrilled.
Yeah, we look forward to meeting you live in person and taking the prize from you in Milan in May. I can tell you, we're already grinning.
Great, I will see you there.
Yeah. To go back to the global view that you have of the packaging world through your work before and also through the WPO, what effects and influences do countries have on each other when we talk about packaging? Can you allude a bit on that?
It's not a direct answer that I'll give you here, and I'm just sort of processing it in my mind. If one breaks it down, we ultimately have, in the packaging world, predominantly a developing world or countries, and you have the developed, and somewhat of a difference in the packaging sector between those two. And the encouraging aspect of this through the WPO is bringing the new technology, the new sciences around packaging to the developing world, and encouraging them to embark and use these new techniques and technologies. And so uplifting them, and through the World Star program that we've just mentioned, it uplifts them because they're now competing on the same stage with the developed countries. And so even though there's this difference, I think slowly, in some countries faster than others, that the gap is closing. How long that gap will take to close completely, it probably won't. It probably won't close in my lifetime or a generation after me either, because some countries just simply don't have the means. They don't have the financial clout to be able to do what a lot of the European countries can do, certainly the Western world or Western Europe. But the nice thing through the WPO, a lot of these developing countries come to us, particular instances ask for help in a particular critical area of packaging. And so there's no doubt in my mind that there's positive influences, and the effect is we now get a resulting scenario where we have an improved packaging in that particular case. And it grows, all the time as new technologies come on, and it's shared on our network program on a daily basis. They pick this up and run with it, with the help of the developed world.
And that can shorten the learning curves.
It's a huge learning curves for some of them. And this is where the educational and training teams help, because they then are going into these countries with this knowledge, and they're there on site, in a physical sense, helping them, which is a huge help for someone who doesn't have the educational knowledge, the science behind why you're doing something, or how do you increase a barrier structure to a material. If you don't know, you don't know. But by having someone there on site with you, helping you through it, helps them enormously.
In many large countries, there are already initiatives and actions for the establishment of sustainable systems. What about smaller countries? Are there any initiatives or actions?
The simple answer to your question is yes, there are. But let me expand on that somewhat. And I must just ensure to the listeners that the size of the country doesn't play a part in what stage in the graph is that country in relation to a real high-tech development or not. And I use, say, that a country like Nigeria. Nigeria is a large West African country. And if I compare them, say, to the Swiss, which is a relatively small country when you compare the two, but the Swiss are very advanced in their packaging. Like Japan. Japan's a small-ish country when you compare it to some of the large developing countries of this world. And so a lot of it stems around the money. Bottom line. Many folk don't want to hear that, but that's the reality. The rich countries have the means to develop those packaging types and putting more science into material than the developing countries of the world. But the good part is that the one can help the other. And this is what we're finding to be the case. And so we go into a lot of large developing countries and are most helpful and useful to them. And a good example of that is in Africa. There are a number of African countries that we are spending a lot of time in, as we are in South America and as we are in Southeast Asia. The opposite effect. A small country like Indonesia by land mass, but a very large country in relation to population. They're the fourth largest population of the world. And we in the WPO spent the last 18 months implementing a circular economy, a recycling system that is full circularity to it in Indonesia in the past 18 months. This has now been handed over to the local people of Indonesia. They've set up their own infrastructures and organizational systems, and they're now implementing this scenario, where previously there was not an effective recycling system in Indonesia at all. There were little snippets here and there on some of the islands, but a fully effective one, no. And so there's a classic example where countries like Austria, and specifically Austria and Australia, those two member countries of WPO, have been working alongside the Indonesians implementing this system.
So do cultural differences play a role when we see these different levels of effort and initiatives in these countries?
100%. 100% they do. Cultural differences is quite a phenomenal aspect, certainly when it comes to packaging, and certainly when it comes to what I've experienced in my past 4 years in this role that I'm in now, and certainly in the 3 years prior when I looked after education worldwide. And having visited so many countries over the last 7 years now, I see it more and more. But to explain this, let me give you an example. But unfortunately, I'm not going to give you the country involved because it would be unfair on that country. But let me say that it is a small country and sort of in the Arab world. And I was doing a training session there, a general packaging technology and engineering training over a week in this capital city of this country. And we got to the point, after a couple of days, we got to the point of sustainability and recycling and all that sort of thing. And we broke for tea. And during tea time, this one young fella came up to me, and I'd say he's about age 24, and I'm saying the age particularly for a particular reason, simply because he's well-educated. He was busy doing his master's at that stage. And he said to me, you've been talking about sustainability and the need for recycling in all countries across the world. I said, absolutely. He said to me, we have a problem in our country. I said, what do you mean a problem? He said, well, I'm sure you've seen since you've been here that our countryside is littered. I said, I didn't notice, but I chose not to comment on it. And he said, well, that's very nice of you. However, it's a big problem. It's a big problem culturally in our country, he told me. I said, why is that? He said, well, from when he was a little boy, if they were driving in a motor car and they were eating whatever and having a can of whatever, cold drink and some munchies or something to eat, we threw out the packaging as we finished the product. I said, you threw it out the window? He said, yes. I said, really? And your parents said nothing? He said, no, they do the same. We do that in our country. It's a cultural norm. Those were his words. Now, when he saw me giving the presentation and how things work in some countries where they don't throw their litter out the windows of the car, and how this is then put in a receptacle by each individual, and it's the norm. And you know yourselves, in Europe, for many European countries, that is the norm. It's nothing unusual. You find the right receptacle and you put the item in that particular receptacle for glass, for metal, for soft plastics, for rigid plastics. And there's no issue. He said, how do I change my people? I said, therein lies the issue.
Okay, now you already said a little bit about cultural differences. How do you approach the task of changing the mindset of people around the world regarding sustainability?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, because it leads beautifully into or from the previous question. So the scenario and the analogy that I was using a moment ago in this particular country, and him asking me how do I change the mindset of a cultural scenario. And I said, well, interesting you asked me that question, and I'll tell you what we've done in other parts of the world where we have a similar problem as you guys are having in your country. And I proceeded to tell him that I cannot change the mindset, which is a cultural scenario in many cases, or often the case. I cannot change the mindset of someone, over the age of 30 or 40 or 50 or 60. I can't change them. And as was the case in the previous question, this fellow was 24. So I let it go lower than 30 and say, well, even a 24-year-old, I can't change the mindset of them. But what I can change the mindset of grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3s. And I can tell you something else, that I have actually done that. And I have done that for the last 16 years in our region where I live, because I teach or give class to grade 1s, grade 2s, and grade 3s on, amongst other things, on the topic of packaging and how do we get to a better landscape, and we do the right thing in terms of recycling. And so I'll make it a lot simpler than I'm telling you when I talk to the grade 1s in terms of a circular economy. I can't use those sort of words. They won't quite know what I'm referring to, but I give them a lot of pictures and they understand what I'm saying. And these little kids are like sponges. They just absorb the information, which is wonderful, because I come back the following year or later that year. Every class I give, one in the first semester, one in the second semester. So I see them twice in a year. And they remember what I tell them. Remember, they don't take notes in class. They're only grade 1s. So everything goes into their head. And they can remind me of stuff that I said in the previous lesson, which might be, 4 months or 5 months prior. And I tell them this is how it should be done in your home. The funny part about it is that when my children were at school and I was on a particular sporting field at this particular school when I was also giving classes, some of the little children would come up and greet me and say, this is my father or my mother or whatever. And the parents would say to me, are you the gentleman who tells us into which receptacle we must put our packaging? And I said, I am the guy, yes. And I hope that you are doing it. Yes, they say. We are, our little boy or our little girl tells us you want to put it in there and you have to put it in that one and not that one. And it is amazing how I can change their minds. Yeah. And they then have changed their parents' minds. There's a classic example that I've just explained. And their grandparents. Because they say, no, granddad, we don't put our plastic in general rubbish. We put it in the plastic recycling bin. Yeah. And we don't drop it on the sidewalk. We find the receptacle to place it in. And when someone says that loud in the street, the grandparent gets a little bit embarrassed and makes sure that he does what his grandson tells him. And so, yes, absolutely, you can change the mindset of people.
That's amazing. To what extent does the WPO have a connection to the United Nations, and what does this entail?
A number of years ago, back in a meeting that we had in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, we had been meeting with representatives from the UN, basically out of Vienna, because of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. And we signed a memorandum of understanding with them back in a meeting in 2017 in Brazil. And what this does, it's brought these two global organizations together. Now you would think, well, what's the value of that? It's of great value to both parties, because the UN, for example, they can get us into countries that we can't normally get into. So they help us from that perspective. But we have the people on the ground in every country, because every country uses packaging. Yeah. And so it's very easy for us. Once we're in the country, we can now start talking to like-minded people. And so this relationship or understanding between the organizations have now gone on for something like 5 years or thereabouts. And we've embarked on programs in a number of countries over recent years. Mongolia comes to mind as being one where we sent in guys from our organization to Mongolia, and they were looking at helping them with improving the packaging side of cheese in the dairy field. So predominantly, dairy products, but in particular cheese, and then also meat, fresh meat, looking at better ways of packaging fresh meat and making sure that the barrier properties are there for shelf life extension and so on. And at the same time, ran some training classes for industry, which is fantastic. And at the moment, doing one in Pakistan, but more in the fruit industry, which is wonderful. It's a whole new ball game going in there and looking at a completely different set of parameters in which to work. And so we will continue. The next one, we've been going into some of the Central African countries and working with groups of folk that are specific in a particular industry and helping them develop that aspect of packaging related to that field. So it's an incredibly good relationship, and both parties benefit from it in different ways.
You mentioned in our preparation talk that everyone who buys non-regional products is driving the need for more packaging. Now in Germany, buying regional is a really big trend. And for me, it's not totally obvious why regional products are better concerning the packaging, because also regional products are being packed. So maybe you can say a little bit about that, what you really mean when you said that.
What I meant, or what I was trying to say, I hope that I said it in the right way and make sure that you're on the same page with me. But I have to go back and say to you, put yourself in the mind of your grandparents, or even further back, but certainly grandparents. And I'm sure you remember your great grandparents, and maybe some of them are even with us still. When they were of a young age, they grew their own crops in their garden, their own vegetables, but they would have gone to the market as well. But they bought fruit and vegetables of that region that they were living in, be that in Germany or wherever, of that region, of that season. In other words, summer, spring, fall, winter, whatever the case might be. That's how they bought and obtained their food year in, year out, in all the countries around the world. Fast forward to you and your lifestyle. And I'm guilty of this as much as you are as well. And I say you, we're all in the same boat. But I know that I have been in Europe in winter and I've eaten bananas. Now, bananas don't grow in your country, number one, in Germany. And number two, it's a summer fruit. It's not a winter fruit. And the only way that I can get bananas in Germany when the snow is falling is by packaging, or the means of packaging, from one of the probably, those countries that produce bananas in a lot of them on the sort of the equatorial regions or subtropical regions of the world. Yeah. That's how you do it, through better packaging. Packaging wasn't available to do this when your grandparents and great-grandparents were with us. And so we are placing the pressure on the system to make sure that there are bananas in Germany when I come and visit you in winter. And that, I don't believe, is what we should be doing. If we want to ensure that we don't have this additional packaging requirement, it makes less packaging necessary in the world, and by not having these high barrier property requirements means it's much easier to recycle predominantly. There are exceptions to the rule regarding that last statement. But reduce the amount of packaging for sure. But are we going to accept that we cannot have bananas in winter in the Northern Hemisphere? That's the question. That's a more important question to answer than, in terms of how does one ensure that folk go about only eating the crop of the season and of the region.
I think that's a really big and probably also very controversial issue, because I don't know if we will get rid of the bananas in winter. I think everyone loves bananas. So it's a really good example. And I think it also opens questions to other topics like, is Europe able to feed its people in winter at all? It's really good that you're mentioning it. It makes us think about our way of life here in Europe, probably also other regions in the world. Yeah, the bananas in Europe is a good example.
And the footprint we have, correct, yeah.
Yeah.
So, this concludes the first part of the podcast we recorded with Professor Pierre Pienaar. As Pierre wanted to share his vast experience as president of the World Packaging Organization WPO with our listeners, we decided to cut this into 2 episodes. Stay tuned for the next episode.